Alright, so I apologize using a different camera, so it kind of cut off. So where I was at was that Butler and Wooster, they were arrested. The court found that they had been wrongly imprisoned. They said that Georgia law had no force on Cherokee land. Andrew Jackson dismissed it, called it unenforceable. He basically told the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court that if he wanted to enforce the law, he would have to do it himself because Jackson would not do it. Jackson showing that he had no respect for the other branches of government. Sometimes that's a problem that we have with some presidents. So now it became fairly obvious, and by the way, Jackson did get Georgia to pardon the two missionaries. But now the Cherokees have two options. They can resist or they can go through with removal. A minority signed the Treaty of Removal in 1835, and they were given a certain number of years to vacate or be forcibly removed. In 1838, federal troops actually began rounding up the Cherokee Indians and placing them in stockades to make sure that they did indeed leave. They lived in horrible conditions. And fun facts, all the leaders who signed the treaty later died under mysterious circumstances in Oklahoma. Many will continue to protest Indian removal, clergymen, women reformers, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and others. Many were angered at the actions of Jackson, but there was nothing that could be done, and thus the Trail of Tears has begun. What we will see is the removal of 12,000 Cherokee Indians, 4,000 of whom will die on the trip. Now, what was supposed to happen was that the federal government had made contracts with people to have food and blankets and other things along the trail for these Native Americans as they went on. Unfortunately, there was a lot of greed. A lot of people pocketed that money, and for that, the Cherokees suffered. It was a terrible situation. They ended up in Oklahoma. So that's how the Trail of Tears happens. You may have questions for me when I see you on Tuesday. Now, let's move to 1832. We see the emergence of the Whigs and some third-party movements. 1832, Henry Clay, as we talked about before, runs against Jackson. We also have another candidate named William Wirt, that's W-I-R-T, who runs on the anti-Masonic party. Because, you know, we talked about conspiracy theories before. There was this belief that the Masons ruled the world. And so both Henry Clay and Andrew Jackson were actually Masons. So William Wirt ran. Now the problem with Wirt running is it split the anti-Jackson vote. But what Wirt did is they were afraid of the Freemasons, and he was one of the first people to really appeal to religious voters. The anti-Masons actually used a national convention to choose their presidential candidate. Other parties during this time in Philadelphia in 1828 and New York in 1829, workers formed their own parties they called the Workies. They wanted to fix economic inequality. They wanted a hefty inheritance tax in order to redistribute wealth. Some of these ideas will later be picked up by other parties. The big problem with this idea, we see this every so often to redistribute wealth, is honestly the math never quite works out. But some of these ideas will be picked up by others later. Now, the big question mark for 1832 was the National Bank. The National Bank had been chartered before Jackson became president, but everyone knew that he was opposed to it. Now, Henry Clay thought that he could use the National Bank as a political tool against Jackson. The idea being that he asked Congress, and Nicholas Biddle, B-I-D-D-L-E, the head of the bank, he asked Biddle to ask Congress to renew the national bank early. Here's what he thought. He thought that either Jackson would veto it, which meant that he would be able to run against Jackson for getting rid of the national bank, because Clay thought, really wrongly, that the national bank was a major issue for a lot of people. Now, if he didn't veto it, then he thought that he would be able to basically paint Jackson as kind of wishy-washy or a flip-flopper. Either way, Clay thought that he would have a good issue. Now, the problem here is Congress votes to reauthorize the bank in 1832. Jackson vetoes it, but he puts out a strong speech explaining why he vetoed it, and that became very popular. Jackson will end up beating Henry Clay by 200,000 votes, a 4-to-1 margin in the Electoral College. Jackson decides to kill the bank early by taking out all the federal funds. He actually had to fire 2 men in the Treasury before he found one who would be stupid enough to do it. This damaged the economy. He took the federal money and began putting them in state banks, which were not well regulated. They were not as cautious with their loaning money. This is a time where there's a lot of loans for land speculation. By 1836, land sales had reached $25 million. Jackson adopted a hard money policy and said that land sale from the government had to be paid with hard currency, no paperbacks. So what this will do is this will actually cause a major recession a little bit down the road. Now, 1836 comes about. Are we good on the time on there?
Yeah.
1836 came about, and Jackson decides not to run for a third term. His Secretary of State, Martin Van Buren, runs. He had 2 nicknames. He was the Little Magician and the Slippery Elm. So that's kind of how he was looked at. He won a narrow victory, 50.2% of the popular vote, and he inherited a weak economy, so it would have been better for him to lose. He also had to deal with the Panic of 1837. Unemployment rises, lots of farms foreclosed, and there's a lot of business failures. Wages will drop 50%. In Philadelphia, 1/3 of the workers were unemployed. Now, this wasn't all because of Jackson's and Van Buren's policies. This was actually a global recession caused in part by the Bank of England when they raised their interest rates. So what banks began to do is they began to call their loans, and people couldn't pay it. If you've ever seen that god-awful Christmas movie with the banker and who, It's a Wonderful Life. You see what happens when there's a call on banks, or when the bank wants people to call their loans. They're going to run out of money. So this led to more constricted credit. The price of cotton also plummeted. They began to call Martin Van Buren Martin Van Ruin. Now, he's also made an enemy of John C. Calhoun in the South for the Amistad. And remember, I highly recommend watching the movie Amistad. You can do it as an extra credit movie critique. So I highly recommend that. We can talk more about that later. So 1840 comes along. The Whigs really want to win, so they decide not to go with Henry Clay. They instead turn to General William Henry Harrison, a man they called Old Tippy Canoe. His hard cider and the log cabin were the symbols of his campaign. The campaign slogan was Tippy Canoe and Tyler too. Tippy Canoe, you remember, is the Indian village he burned to the ground. He painted Martin Van Buren as a bureaucrat. The Whigs also mobilized women to get their husbands to vote for them. The Whigs were able to flip the switch. For this election, the Whigs were the party of family values, while the Democrats under Van Buren were a bunch of dirty old perverts. So the Democrats in this election were against a lot of things. Van Buren opposed tariffs. He opposed money for internal improvements. He opposed the Bank of the United States. And he favored Indian removal, and he was for states' rights. Whereas the Whigs were in favor of tariffs, they wanted internal improvements, they wanted a Bank of the United States, they opposed Indian removal, and they wanted a strong central government. So this election, you had a big difference between the two candidates. Harrison wins by 150,000 votes, 4-1 in the Electoral College. He gives a 105-minute inaugural speech where he catches pneumonia and he dies about a month later. John Tyler, who ran as his vice president, who was a former Democrat, anti-Jackson Democrat, is the first vice president to ascend to the presidency because of the death of a president. That basically ends the Jackson movement. Now, before I let you go, I just wanted to thank everyone who has reached out to me. It means a lot. I'm sorry I'm not there with you next week, but I really look forward to getting back into the routine and getting back to talking to you guys next week. Do me a favor, after you watch this, if you got questions, let me know. But please leave a comment in the comment section just to let me know everybody has read it. I get those notifications on the phone. Thanks a lot. I'll see you guys on Tuesday.